Thank you very much. It's very nice to see some of the old friends here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about something Professor Blacksland also talked about, which is the economic dimension of these regional groupings. And as he mentioned, we are in a kind of transition focused between the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. And the rise of India definitely occupies a very important part of this ongoing shift of attention by some of the major players in this region. And as far as the geographical connectivity between the two oceans are concerned, there's nothing really new from Japan's perspective, because Japan has been dependent on petroleum import from the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean sea lane has always been very important for Japan, except that Japan was almost 100% dependent on the US 7th Fleet for protection of safe passage in this region in the past. But in more recent years, Japan is increasing its own security contribution to the safe passage of the vessels in the Indian Ocean region. So, but this recent the change in rhetoric, especially represented by the renaming of the U.S. command from the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command, was not really a new thing for Japan. And in fact, even for the United States, this change of command is nothing new. I remember back in 2007, when I was organizing a conference at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies with Ian Story and others, we were already using the Indo-Pacific as a concept in one of those workshops. So the vocabulary communicated by Abe to Trump in 2017, I believe, was already a decade old by that time. So anyway, Japan's continuous interest is to anchor the US commitment to the security and also the economic interest in this region. They go hand in hand. It's very important that the US sees this region not only important region in terms of the maritime geopolitics, which means that by dominating the Pacific Ocean, the US could push the defense perimeter as far west as possible, which is a very geopolitics concept. But in terms of geoeconomics also, if the US geopolitical interests coincide with economic interest in the western part of the Pacific, meaning markets in Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, Australia, then the US commitment to the security of this region will be more assured than just geopolitical interest. So for that matter, Japan took a very active role together with Australia at the end of the Cold War in late 1980s to launch Apec, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, to which the United States and other Pacific Rim countries were invited to join. And although Japan and Australia very carefully put ASEAN countries forward in a kind of leadership positions, it was a leadership from behind by these countries. So the US commitment to the economic integration of this region was partly security motivated and partly economics motivated as well. If you're old enough to remember the trade war of the 1980s, and if you have studied the US-Japan bilateral trade disputes as a doctoral dissertation, then you understand what I'm saying very clearly. It was very intense economic competition between Japan and the United States, during which the United States really threatened Japanese access to the US market. And to defend against such unilateral move by the United States, again, Japan had appealed to multilateralism in the region by engaging the US into a greater multilateral framework. It's sort of like tying up Gulliver. US is an economic giant, but by including it into a multilateral framework and disciplining US economic behavior under this multilateral setting was very much behind Japan's attempt to create this Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. We see the same pattern repeating in more recent years, and when New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, and smaller economies were launching TPP, Japan wasn't in the negotiation in the early stage. Japan waited until the United States joined the negotiation. Then Japan joined the negotiation. Okay. So Japan was not willing to negotiate. Neither US was willing to negotiate bilateral free trade between the two countries, but Japan joined the multilateral TPP as soon as the US joined. And within that framework, again, Japan tried to ensure the US commitment to regional economic integration and more disciplined free trade in the region-wide integration. But as you know, Trump put the US out and Japan's calculation didn't go as it planned. But of course, Japan wasn't betting on just one agreement. Japan was concurrently negotiating RCEP. And in fact, RCEP negotiation and TPP negotiations were leveraged, mutually leveraged. So the progress in one encourages the other negotiation to also go deeper into liberalization. So it was very important that the TPP is happening when Japan was trying to liberalize the RCEP grouping, especially against China's resistance to go fully into free trade. So Japan did sign RCEP. Japan is still hoping that the US would return to TPP, well, CPTPP now. But if you understand the US ratification process and all that in the Congress executive dynamics, it's quite unlikely to see any US return to TPP anytime soon. But of course, the Trump very cleverly, quickly put pressure on Japan to negotiate the bilateral free trade agreement. And the US has already recovered some of the would-be gains which US was supposed to gain under TPP by imposing those conditions on Japan in the bilateral setting, like the beef tariff concession Japan offered in TPP was already matched by the United States. I mean, US was not entitled to get that kind of concession, but the US complained because US could no longer compete against Australian beef. And so this kind of behavior by the US goes against a closer quadrilateral partnership, because without the fully committing economically, the solidarity among the Quad members will always face this kind of skepticism by America's trade partners, including Japan. So what will happen in the coming years? I think, let me just share the screen here. And I do have some fancy slides here. Okay. So the Indo-Pacific as an economic group is already bigger than the European Union or North American group, and is only expected to grow further with faster population growth and faster economic growth in many of those member countries, except Japan, of course. So Japan sees itself as a shrinking but significant player within the world's biggest and fast-growing grouping. So Japan's strategy is to take a hitch ride on this growing economic bloc and negotiate the best deal vis-a-vis the other two groups, namely the European Union and the North American group. With European Union, Japan already signed the free trade agreement, economic partnership agreement formally. And if Japan managed to bring the US into TPP again, that will serve Japan's economic interest. So the kind of world Japan is looking at in the medium term is the world in which China, India become the number one, number two economies, together with the growing presence of Indonesia and other, the so-called emerging 7 countries. Excuse me, sorry, here. The table shows Japan's trade agreement when it was signed, and also you can see a similar pattern unfolding in terms of strategic agreement. Japan is not only signing those economic agreements, but also expanding the network of strategic partnerships with Quad countries and beyond. I would call it Quad Plus. And UK, France, Canada, they already have signed AXA, for example, and this facilitates joint military exercises and other joint activities. Australia's case, Japan and Australia are as close as ever, and Australia is already next to the United States as the closest defense partner. So what we are seeing is bifurcation at the strategic security chessboard and economic chessboard. But the pattern of alignment are not yet identical. It really depends on how China behaves. If China threatens India continuously, and then the India may gravitate more toward the other members of Quad. But if China disciplines itself in terms of threatening neighbors, then China's economic power will speak to the future of regional integration, and China will continue to be included economically. So the kind of the supply chain realignment the US is talking about depends on how China behaves in the security front, and also it depends on how the private sector responds to the call by the government. Looking at, for example, the ongoing restructuring of the semiconductor industry, I see that the private sectors are not blindly listening to the governments. They have their own the profit motivations, and relocation of the production and research facilities are driven by those business considerations for most. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.